Welcome back to Unlimited Reads. You're with Chris, and thanks for joining me today as I will be bringing to you another spoiler chat, this time for another classic Stephen King novel, Pet Sematary. Now, given how much I enjoyed Salem's Lot recently and did a spoiler chat on that, it really gave me a craving for some of King's earlier works, and for me, this one was an absolute no-brainer. Now, make no mistake, this book is very unsettling, was to me anyway, and contains themes which will shock you to your core if you're reading this as a parent. Now, I haven't read this one since I was 15 years old. It's been a long time. I've always been afraid to pick it up again, but I was really proud of myself for growing a set and picking it up and cracking this bad boy open. Okay, let me tell you about the plot taken from the cover. The house looked right, felt right to Dr. Ellie Creed, rambling, old, unsmart and comfortable, a place where the family could settle, the children grow and play and explore. The rolling hills and meadows of Maine seemed a world away from the fume-choked dangers of Chicago. Only the occasional big truck out on the two-lane highway, grinding up through the gears, hammering down the long gradients, growled out an intrusive threat. But behind the house and far away from the road, that was safe, just a carefully cleared path up into the woods where generations of local children have processed with the solemn innocence of the young, taking them with them their dear departed pets for burial. A sad place maybe, but safe, surely a safe place, not a place to seep into your dreams, to wake you sweating with fear and foreboding. So the Creeds arrive in Ludlow after a long trip from Chicago, where Lewis now has a prominent career as a head doctor at the local university, so it looks to be a secure position, and he's looking forward to providing a safe environment and where his children can flourish and the family can prosper. They meet Judd Crandall, the kindly elderly neighbour from across the busy road, from where the trucks fly along at all hours, and serves as a hell of a foreshadowing tool. The family dynamic is established early with Lewis, wife Rachel, daughter Ellie, son Gage, and of course their pet cat Church. Judd shows the family the pet cemetery nearby, with all the markers painstakingly created by the heartbroken children of the past. There's an aura of sadness there, and it's revealed later that beyond the border of the pet cemetery over the deadfall lies a mystical, mysterious Micmac burial ground, first used by Native American Indians, which is reputed to have the power of resurrection. So while Lewis is on his own and Gage, Ellie and Rachel are off visiting his in-laws in Chicago for a long weekend, I think it is, Church gets hit by one of the trucks and he's frozen in the ground, and Lewis has to pull him out and make the decision of breaking Ellie's heart at the news of Church's death, or does he go up to the ancient Micmac burial ground to bury Church and hopefully bring him back in order to save his daughter some heartache? Now, is this a mistake? Maybe, as the book is famous for. But what's really fucked up is when Gage gets hit by the truck and Lewis, racked with guilt and grief, buries him at the burial ground, and all hell breaks loose, which is what the book has become famous for, and the subsequent adaptation. Okay, let's talk about Lewis, probably the most tragic character in the whole book. Oh my god, when I read the scene where little Gage chases after the kite where the family is picnicking on the meadow behind the house, Lewis realises that Gage has run into the road and he sprints after him, and the tension when you're reading this scene, as a parent in particular, is you're panic stricken through the whole scene. And what makes it worse is that Lewis is sprinting after him. Gage has gone into the road, a truck is coming, and the heartbreaking thing and the most gut-wrenching thing is Lewis touches Gage's clothing very briefly before stumbling and tripping, and he's too late, and Gage gets hit by the truck. Now, as a parent, it is a really difficult scene to read, and it's interesting how you can draw a comparison with how you would process something like this now when you read it as to when you read it as a teenager, which I don't think you'd process it in a similar way. The way you process it as an adult, and more particularly a parent, is very different, and it's very confronting and very uncomfortable to read about. I think King really captures how grief can grip you and consume you. I think he does this very well. Now, the whole thing about the exhumation of Gage and the subsequent burial up in the Micmac burial ground, on the surface you have to question Lewis's sanity and morals. you could be forgiven for judging him for what he does, because you would think, who in their right mind would dig up their poor dead son and try and bury them in an effort to resurrect them and pretend that everything is okay? Now, on the surface, you think it would be very easy to judge him, but I think what you need to do is dig a little bit deeper and think about it a little bit more, because it's not only Lewis's grief and guilt that is driving him to commit this morbid act. What's actually happening under the surface is the burial ground itself is an evil presence, and it's proven that its influence is felt when Rachel is on the run back from Chicago, because Ellie has had nightmares and convinces Rachel to head back to Ludlow in a rental car from one of the airports, and for some reason the rental car breaks down, because the burial ground itself has that influence, that reach, that didn't want Rachel to get to Lewis before he buried Gage up in the Micmac burial ground. So it's not only Lewis's fault for this, it's the actual burial ground that reaches out and has an influence and consumes Lewis as well, which isn't quite, it turns out that it isn't quite as simple as it seems. It's not just a case of him being riddled with guilt and digging up Gage's body. He's been influenced in some way by this evil presence that is the Micmac burial ground. I thought the character of Ellie, Lewis's daughter, was very well done, with the fact that she has a bit of the shining, like Danny Torrance in The Shining, but her shining is nowhere near as strong as Danny's, but she has vivid enough dreams that come to pass as reality, and they're very, very frightening for her, because she knows what's going to happen. So she doesn't have any visions in waking hours, it's all in nightmares, and she frightens her mum and her grandparents so much that Rachel is compelled to go back and try and see what is happening in Ludlow before things get really out of hand. The scenes in the book, the background scenes with Zelda, Rachel's crippled sister, struck down by spinal meningitis, who is imprisoned on the bed, is very confronting to read about, because there is a lot of guilt about that time in Rachel's life that she is hoarding as well, which really shapes her as a character, but it was very difficult to read about. I remember being scared shitless about it when I was a kid reading the book, but as an adult it was still a little bit unsettling. The fight between Lewis and his father-in-law at Gage's funeral was shocking, and they have a really turbulent history. Rachel's father never believed that Lewis was good enough for her, and there's always been that hostility between the two men. And what happens is things get out of hand at the funeral viewing, or the coffin viewing, and the altercation results in Gage's coffin being knocked off its stand. Now, you could go one of two ways of making the reader cringe. You could either have Gage's body toppling out, all right, which is going to be bad enough, but what King decided to do was a bit of genius here. He managed to have the coffin fall off the stand, and we only got a glimpse of Gage's lifeless hand in his suit sleeve. I think in some respects that's more horrendous and more shocking than the body falling out completely, because you're just getting a hint of Gage's body there with his hand, and you're letting your imagination do the rest. And I think that was a masterstroke on King's part. Now, just backtracking a little bit to Lewis digging up Gage's poor body, I'm going to read something to you. I was debating on whether or not I do this or not, because it is a fairly graphic scene, but I just wanted to show you how strong King's writing was when he wrote this, and it's a fine example of how good writing would pretty much make you feel sick. So I was on the fence about it, and I thought I just want to share this passage of writing. It does go for a page and a bit, but I just wanted to prove to you how impactful this writing was for me. And this is taken from chapter 51, which is in the final pages of the book. Here we go. The smell hit him first, and Lewis recoiled, gagging. He hung on the edge of the grave, breathing hard, and just when he thought he had his gorge under control, his entire big, tasteless meal came up in a grotesque spurt. He threw up on the far side of the grave and then put his head against the ground, panting. At last the nausea passed. Teeth clamped together, he took the flashlight out of his armpit and shone it down into the open coffin. A deep horror that was very nearly awe stole over him. It was the sort of feeling usually reserved for the worst nightmares, the ones you can barely remember upon wakening. Gage's head was gone. Lewis's hands were trembling so badly he had to hold the flashlight with both hands, gripping it the way a policeman is taught to grip his service revolver on the target range. Still, the beam jittered back and forth, and it was a moment before he could train the pencil-thin beam back into the grave. It's impossible, he told himself. Just remember that what you saw is impossible. He slowly moved the narrow beam up Gage's 3-foot length from the new shoes to the suit pants, the little coat. Oh, Christ, no 2-year-old was ever meant to wear a suit. To the open collar, to his breath caught in a harsh sound that was too outraged to be a gasp, and all his fury at Gage's death came back in a rush, drowning fears of the supernatural, the paranatural, and his growing certainty that he had crossed over into the country of the mad. Lewis scrabbled in his back pocket for his handkerchief and pulled it out. Holding the light in one hand, he leaned into the grave again, almost past the point of balance. If one of these segments of grave line had fallen now, it would have surely broken his neck. Gently, he used the handkerchief to wipe away the damp moss that was growing on Gage's skin, moss so dark that he had been momentarily fooled into thinking Gage's whole head was gone. The moss was damp, but no more than a scum. He could have expected it. There had been rain, and a grave liner was not watertight. Flashing his light to either side, Lewis saw that the coffin was lying in a thin puddle. Beneath the light slime of growth, he saw his son. The mortician, aware that the coffin could not be opened after such a terrible accident, had nonetheless done the best he could. Morticians almost always did. Looking at his son was like looking at a badly made doll. Gage's head bulged in strange directions. His eyes had sunken deep behind closed lids. Something white protruded from his mouth like an albino tongue, and Lewis thought at first it might be some kind of fluid extrusion. They had perhaps used too much embalming fluid. It was tricky stuff at best, and with the child it was next to impossible to tell how much was enough or too much. Then he realised it was only cotton. He reached in and plucked it out of the boy's mouth. Gage's lips, oddly lax and seeming somehow too dark and too wide, closed with a faint but audible plip. He threw it into the grave, where it floated in the shallow puddle and gleamed a loathsome white. Now one of Gage's cheeks had a hollow, old man's look. "Gage," he whispered, "going to take you out now, okay?" So that's really difficult to read, and apologies for that, but it just wanted to prove how impactful and how much of an effect this kind of writing had on me as a parent. Now, it is only just fiction, but it just proves how strong King was. He was at the height of his powers when he wrote this book, and he almost never published it. It sat in a drawer for a little while until Tabby convinced him to publish it, because writing the book scared Stephen King himself. So that's why. And again, apologies for that, but I just wanted to share that with you because it is probably one of the most memorable passages of writing in the whole book. The climax was really, really intense and nail-biting, with Gage murdering Judd and Rachel before Creed eventually stops him. And the final scenes are something that will stick with me for many, many years to come. Now, I'll briefly touch upon the adaptation, not the abomination and dumpster fire that was 2019. I hate that movie. I'm talking about the proper one, the 1989 adaptation, the movie starring Dale Midkiff as Lewis, which I thought was a brilliant casting choice. Even a better casting choice was Fred Gwynne as Judd Crandall. Now, I felt that I watched the movie again straight after reading the book, and it was very, very true to the book, but it proved to me on how rushed the movie was. As good as it was, it still stacks up and hasn't really dated, but the movie was very rushed. With the events that happen, it all happens very, very quickly, and I think rather than a remake movie like they did in 2019, I think this one needs to be made into a TV series, at least 8 episodes, to be put on one of the streaming services, which gives enough room to explore everything. You can go pretty much deeper into the Micmac burial ground mythology and the Wendigo legend. You can look at the complex relationship between Lewis and his father-in-law. You could take your time with things. You can build things up. You can end each episode on a cliffhanger. You could go into a lot more detail about the resurrection itself, on seeing Gage and Church coming out of the ground. You could see a lot more flashback with Judd Crandall's past as well. So there you go, guys. That is it for my spoiler chat for Pet Cemetery. Thank you so much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider subscribing to get me to the 1,000 subscriber mark and beyond. But until the next video, guys, happy reading.